Hey guys, I miss you. I really do. And I'm sorry it's been a little bit since my last posting. I've been trying to wrap up my last semester of my schooling, or latest semester I should say, not done. But now that I got a break, it's time to get back to it. And I thought I'd try something a little bit different as we're trying to improve on the videos and the visuals of whatever that we can do in the time that we are in right now. A little more on that in a minute. But what I want to talk to you guys about is a story that just kept coming up in my latest semester of schooling. In the books that I was reading, what I was studying, in the papers I was writing, this story just kept popping out. And to me, it merits a deeper look in terms of what it meant back then and what it means today. How can we apply this? And if you don't know the story, it's found in Acts chapter 17, verses 16 through 34. And a lot of guys refer to it as Paul's Sermon on Mars Hill. Now what happens is, Paul comes into Athens, right? In Athens, it's like the hub for the greatest thinkers of the world back then, in the ancient world. It was where a lot of the major philosophers were. It's where the major schools were, and it was also the location of this council called that Council of Areopagus. I think I got that right. Anyways, what happens is, you start out in verse 16, Paul comes into Athens, and it says that he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. Paganism, right? Pluralistic society where they don't want to exclude the wrong God. They want to include as many as they can, so that maybe they get it right, and that way they appease everybody, or whatever the mindset was. They had many idols to false gods, right? And so what does Paul do? Well, he goes into missionary mode. He's on a second missionary journey right now. And he starts out by, it says he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace, day by day with those who happened to be there. He did what he could with what he had to work with. He spread his message to those who would listen. Well, some guys catch wind of what Paul's doing and who he is and what he represents and the message that he brings, and they decide to bring him to this council of Areopagus. Now, what this council is, they are the guys who still had vast influence in the Greek world back then. They typically decided rules of religion and morality and what was wrong and what was right. And in a lot of ways, I guess you could say that they were responsible for just how many idols were in the city of Athens. Well, what does Paul do? He gets to work. And he goes about it in a way that, to me, it makes sense for our time right now, the weeks after Easter, right? We just got done celebrating the resurrection of Christ and the crucifixion from Good Friday. And I've heard a lot of lessons online lately about both the cross and the empty tomb and what that means. But for me, if you want to know what the resurrection means after Easter, well, Paul starts to kind of help us understand, what do we do with that? Does it matter only on Easter Sunday, or does it matter in everyday living, in everything that we do, every person that we encounter? What does Easter mean? What does the resurrection of Christ mean to us every other day past Easter, right? Well, take a look at what Paul's arguing with this council up on was typically known as Mars Hill. Now, if you're wondering what's behind me, this is a modern day picture of Mars Hill. I can't see it. It's a green screen for me, but you'll see it in the video. Yes, I'm a nerd. It's cool. But what Paul ends up giving is just this perfect for me, it's a very flawless argument that leads to Christ. More on that in a second. It kicks off, Paul's sermon kicks off with him kind of acknowledging an altar to the unknown God. Now what this is that they have this setup to all the gods that they have not thought of yet, right? Or the ones that they haven't encountered yet. Remember, they have a lot of idols, and whenever they decide, yeah, this God works, well, set up an idol for him and a way to worship him, right? Well, Paul kicks it off, and he says, in verse 23, he says, now what you worship is something unknown. I am going to proclaim to you. In other words, let me hit you with a little knowledge about what you're missing in terms of who the real God is. And I'm not going to read through it, but I'm going to give you the highlights. He says, first off, verse 24, God is the creator of the universe. The guy that you're missing is the guy that put all of this into motion, right? And not only that, next verse, he is the one that sustains life. He's the reason why this ball we call Earth is still rolling and we're all still breathing. We're all still here. And he keeps going as to argue that he's the ruler of all nations. He's the father of all, right? And then he gets to what I consider to be his fifth overall point in this sermon, and that is that God is the judge. He's the one that we're going to answer to. Now, if I'm a Greek and I did not know this God, at this point, I start to wonder, have I been missing out on something truly important? Who is this God that this guy is talking about? Well, he's the God overall, in and all, through all, and he is the one that we're going to answer to one day. But then Paul takes that moment to introduce them to somebody new. And that's Christ. Verse 30, he says, in the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. But verse 31 is the good news. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. And here is where Paul gives his greatest argument. He says, he has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead. See, God, he didn't just... The message that Paul's trying to give here, and is doing well at giving it, is that, yeah, we're going to answer to God one day, but there's this one guy who died. And because of who he is to us and to God, he was raised from the dead. Well, okay, that's cool. But what does this mean for us? What does the resurrection of Christ really mean after Easter for us, right? Well, to me, you look at where Paul takes this argument. He starts off with God and telling you all these things, great things about God and who he is and just how powerful he is and how he just had his finger in everything throughout history, right? But then introduce Christ. Now you start to figure out what we are to do with Jesus, right? You look at 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 2, verse 1 and 2. Paul writes to the Corinthians, when I came to you, brothers, I did not come with eloquence or superior wisdom. Hint, sounds like the Greeks, right? They love their philosophy and their intellect. They are the intellectual elite of their time. And Paul says, I didn't come to you with all that as I proclaim to you the testimony about God. Sounds like the argument that he was making throughout the main portions of his sermon on Mars Hill. Talking about the testimony about who God is. But then you get to verse 2. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Paul goes from the testimony about God, and God, he deserves all of this recognition. I mean, he has been there from the start. He is going to be there in the end. We're going to be there with him. But notice how Paul says, I resolved to know nothing except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And this isn't the only time where Paul makes just such great emphasis on who Jesus is and the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. You go to Philippians chapter 3, and Paul starts out this chapter as talking about his former life as a Pharisee. He had power, he had influence, he had money, or whatever else that came with that. He was one of the elites. But verse 7 says, but whatever was to my profit, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. Pick it up in verse 10. He gets to what is most important, both for him and for us to know. Verse 10 says, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings. Why? Well, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow to attain to the resurrection from the dead. You want to know what to do with Easter and the resurrection after Easter? You got to share. You got to get up on your own proverbial Mars Hill whenever you got other people asking, what is it that makes you you as a Christian? And to me, there's nothing else except for the resurrection of Christ. Why? Because that means that I get to share in that. I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection. You know, I can't imagine what it was like to be in the audience listening to Paul on Mars Hill, or to be one of the recipients of any of his letters, because to me, just about everything that Paul does, says, or writes points back to Christ. And what does that mean for us? Well, everything points back to Christ, to his death, to his burial, and to his resurrection. If that's the example that's laid out for us, then I encourage you to follow it. I wasn't planning on including this, but just popped into my head, and I feel like I have to now. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, he says in the middle part of it, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. Want to know what reason that is for me? It's that tomb is still empty. It's that Christ is still risen. And through baptism, I get to share in that. I hope, I pray that whatever you face in your daily life, or whatever encounters that you have, somehow your life, either through speech or example, points back to that empty tomb. That Christ is still risen. I love you all. And I hope you're doing well. Until I get to see you again.